take communities that were called slums and turn them into wastelands, took what were network-rich communities but resource-poor communities and turned them into frayed networks and even more limited economic resources. It's in that economic environment that hip-hop emerges. It emerges in the mid-1970s, in some ways a high point. Hip-hop becomes this cultural voice to say, look, we have stories to tell that don't speak to the images and reflections of who we are. We have a vibrant set of cultural voices and ideas, and it began as a wide range of expression, taking the incredible rich oral tradition, which everyone here shares, especially my esteemed colleague, Professor Dyson, on the ability to speak and tell stories in ways that are profoundly compelling, that are emotionally intelligent and intellectually intelligent at the same time. And in that space, hip-hop fills this deep void of seeing people recognize them. Now, what happens over time is that hip-hop becomes a product. And when it becomes a commercial product, it gets pressed into the service of a history of images and representations of African Americans. And the greatest irony of what's happened in commercial hip-hop is that it now begins to reflect the prime stereotypes about African Americans that drove the justification of slavery, the justification of Jim Crow, and the idea that we're in a post-race society. Hear me, gangster culture comes out of chronic joblessness. It's an economy. It's an alternative economic source. So is the public sex trade. There's always people interested in that market. So, you know, these things are real economic options. But they became cultural products as well as alternative economies. So thug life becomes a thug product. And stripping doesn't just become a side job on your way to college, but a cultural idea that reflects who you ought to be. And when that happens, then we have now a market economy for a self-destructive conception of who we are. Now, the reason we're trapped is because it's a real historical condition, right? It's a response to extraordinary levels of suffering, isolation, refusal, denial, and just economic despair. We can't explain hip-hop and explain a lot of the stories of great suffering and crisis and anger and rage and also alternative good times if we don't honor that reality. But at what point do we have to ask a much higher question of that process, where thug life shouldn't be a product, it should be a crisis that we try to change. Right? Not an idea we try to consume, right? We're too busy consuming and not asking ourselves about how do we see this really as a flare, a red flag telling us, look, this is a crisis. But because it has become an economy that has more entry-level jobs, you have more entry-level job opportunities to be a gangster rapper than you do to be in any other industrial industry in an urban center in America. That's so true. So how can you tell young people not to be a thug or to aspire to a culture of thuggery when they have more opportunities to go to jail and tell more stories about that experience than they do to have upward mobility and reasonable opportunity?